Every mainstream explanation of the pyramids assumes one thing, that the only technology available to ancient builders was physical: ropes, ramps, copper tools, and all of that stuff. But there are multiple completely independent esoteric traditions channeled decades apart by different people with no contact with each other that all say something very different. They all point to the same missing piece. Not a tool, but a state of consciousness. This is a topic I'm really excited to dive deep into because it is an obsession that I have had since I was very young. When I was at university, I actually turned my sister into an alien and created all of these fake artifacts. This ended up being my final major project, by the way, guys. I was not afraid of being a little bit kooky back then. A lot of my obsession came with how the pyramids were actually crafted, because what history is saying happened doesn't make sense to me. It never made sense to me back then, and it doesn't make sense to me now. And the more that I've learned about consciousness and what our dormant human abilities are, the more it's made me think maybe we're not meant to be searching for a tool out there, but we are the tool. So let's start with what's actually documented, because this part isn't about speculation. So mainstream Egyptology's consensus is that the pyramids were built by large, organized crews of Egyptian workers, using copper tools, wooden sledges, earthen ramps, and levers over several decades. Historians estimate that the Great Pyramid of Giza took about 20 years to build, but with each of the stone's blocks weighing an average of 2.5 to 15 tons. For me, the math just isn't mathing here. Like, where are we pulling 20? It doesn't make sense. But multiple people have come out to say that the amount of time that this has supposedly taken to build doesn't coincide with what was actually done. So this is what we're currently going off, that some civilization was using very basic instruments to chip away at each of the stones and drag them with their bare hands across the desert, because some of these stones were found in like far outreach places. Some of the stones came from right next door, but some of them came from hundreds of miles away. How are we suggesting that these primitive civilizations were able to just pick up these stones and just walk them over hundreds of miles? Come on, guys. What I'm proposing in this video is that potentially the development of these pyramids wasn't actually done in the way that we think. And although we're currently looking for tools and evidence and proof, which we can't find, which seems to be completely either buried beneath the earth or undiscoverable, maybe we're looking for the wrong type of tool. Maybe we are the tool. We're going to go into some esoteric texts today and spiritual traditions, which go into legends about how these pyramids were built. And you'll start to see that although we can't prove the validity of these myths, what we can draw is stories, overlapping stories at that, about a different technology that we still have access to today, but is just lying dormant within our own bodies. So there are three completely separate spiritual and esoteric traditions spanning almost a century, channeled by different people who have never crossed paths, and they all describe the same core idea about how the pyramids were actually built. The three things we're going to be covering: the Edgar Cayce readings from the 1930s, the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, also circulated in the 1930s, and the Law of One, channeled decades later in the 1980s through what's known as the Ra material. So three different sources, three different eras, and every single one describes the pyramids being built not through physical labor alone, but through consciousness itself as the mechanism. You guys know that I love to find a way that our consciousness is way more powerful than we give ourselves credit for, so let's go through each one. Now, before we go into any of this, I do want to say that I'm not 100% vouching for the validity of channeled sessions, but what I am saying is some of these things just make sense. And so whether you believe this or you don't believe it, I'm not necessarily proposing proof here. I'm proposing theories. So take what you like, leave what you don't, and let's just have a conversation. Let's allow our imaginations to expand past where modern science and history is telling us that they should be. So let's start with the Law of One, which was channeled through a series of sessions with an entity identifying as Ra. So Ra states directly that the pyramids were what they call thought-built, so constructed from thought forms created by their social memory complex using what they call the forces of one. So not physical construction in the way that we understand it necessarily today, but intelligent energy directed by consciousness, shaping and positioning the stone. Ra also emphasizes that the pyramid shape itself does not work on its own, and it's an arrangement, a geometry that focuses on spirals energy that goes upwards. And the pyramids were then charged and operated using crystals for initiation, for healing, for balancing energy on both a personal and a planetary level. If you take this literally, it reframes the entire structure. So the pyramid isn't the technology, the pyramid is the vessel. And then consciousness was the actual technology being used. What I'm assuming that this references is that people were able to get themselves into a state where they were coherent and regulated enough, where they could essentially have some kind of out-of-body experience. And it's very monk-like. There's this story of monks that went into the depths of winter, and using nothing but their body warmth, they were able to maintain a core temperature that was very high for an entire night, because they got themselves into this state of being able to manipulate their own internal biology without our default programming coming online. What the law of one really speaks about is that everything has the ability to be manipulated. And technically, if we could learn to control our mind, stretch our consciousness, and expand past the limitations that, quite honestly, we as Western society has placed on ourselves of what is possible and what is not, we really don't live in curiosity anymore. Let's be honest, we're probably suppressing a load of things that, it's very, very classic for kids to forget all of their past life experiences and to close off any psi abilities that were starting to develop when they were young because they wanted to fit in. This has been seen across the ages, that we suppress until there's nothing left. And then we believe that everything outside of that is magic, when actually I think it's just dormant potentiality that we have inside of ourselves. But this would mean that we could essentially get into a frequency that was resonant with, say, stone or rock, because everything has consciousness. And when you get into that place, you could basically will the rock to break or shift. Or it could be a completely different mechanism where they were able to somehow coincide with the elements in some way. And Matthias de Stefano speaks about this, where your consciousness is able to communicate with the different elements. So what would happen if your mind could communicate with water, for example? Would you be able to direct water to help split the stone? What if you could directly communicate with the earth or with the rock and use that element instead? Would you be able to remove the heaviness and the denseness of the stone itself to be able to move it across the miles that these primitive people were supposedly to have traveled without any other sense of vehicle or any other tools? That makes much more sense if they had a way to make the rock lighter. And, without bringing this into UAP disclosure territory too much, they have found these balls of really, really heavy flying material. And a couple of these have been captured. And when they've been captured, they're much lighter. And you're able to kind of pick them up. And as they, turn off or disengage or get used to being on the ground, they get heavier and heavier and heavier, insinuating that there is some technology that's being used, whether that's inside of the sphere or some kind of technology it's tapping into, which allows it to basically lighten the load. Yes, that could have been a technology that we built, like we're seeing here with the UAP disclosure, but this also could have been just a state of mind that the Egyptians or the people that built these pyramids could tap into and could use to manipulate the elements, to manipulate the rock, the stone, the heaviness and the density of these particular building blocks. I just don't see, even if you created some kind of pulley system or whatever people are trying to say, I just don't see how you're going to drag these rocks all of that way and then take them all the way up to the top of the pyramid. It just doesn't make sense. But if we start to understand that something that would look like magic to us, but may just be a tool of the mind, that makes much more sense as to how we could have created a feat like this in 20 years. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting, because decades before the raw material was ever channeled, Edgar Cayce, which is one of the most documented psychics of the 20th century, was describing something really, really similar. And in his readings, Cayce claimed that survivors of Atlantis fled to Egypt around 10,500 BC, bringing them with advanced spiritual and energetic knowledge. And he said that they built the Great Pyramid not as a tomb, but as a pyramid of initiation, a hall of records, encoding spiritual knowledge for future generations. And critically, Cayce claimed that the stone blocks weren't moved by manual labor at all, and he described them instead being levitated, floated into place, using consciousness and natural universal forces most of us have completely forgotten how to access. He even named specific figures included in this, and a ruler he calls Ra-Ta, alongside Hermes. And I also find it very interesting that two completely separate channeled traditions both center around the name Ra as central to the pyramid's construction. Neither source knew of the specific wording, yet the name, the concept, the mechanism, consciousness over the tools, line up almost exactly. And so everything we were just speaking about before around how the consciousness could be the vehicle for levitating rocks, this is literally written in a text. And I know again that this is a channeled piece of text and we can't vouch for the validity 100%, but I do find it interesting that two channeled pieces of text that were channeled before the internet, before you'd be able to like Google around whether someone else had said this and to align your stories, they're both saying the same thing. I personally think that this is really compelling. And then the third source is the Emerald Tablets of Thoth. Now, I do want to be transparent here that the version most people read today was actually published in the 1930s by an author named Doreel, and it's not actually an authenticated ancient document. It's part of a modern esoteric tradition, but it's not actually verified by archaeology. But within that tradition, nevertheless, Thoth describes raising a mighty pyramid using the power that overcomes Earth force, meaning gravity, and references using crystals and what he calls etheric forces to do it. So again, gravity being overcome, not with machines, but with a force description that sounds a lot like directed consciousness or energy. This is starting to feel very Star Wars-esque, but I do wonder whether even a lot of these movies are really onto something. Like when you start to go down the realms of Robert Monroe's work and the Monroe Institute and what our consciousness is actually capable of doing, you start realizing that a lot of these things actually aren't particularly out of the ordinary. This idea of being able to use our mind to levitate actually isn't that far out of the realms of possibilities. There have actually been some studies on this kind of phenomenon. For example, Nina Kulagina, who was a Soviet telekinesis expert between the 1960s and 80s, actually went into a lab and was tested. She was actually tested for 2 decades by the Soviet researchers across 25 institutions. And 40 scientists studied her, including 2 Nobel laureates. I don't know. And they managed to document small moving objects under glass, separating egg yolk from white in saline solution and reportedly affecting a frog's heart rate. And all of this was filmed.
According to those present at these demonstrations, it sometimes takes Mrs. Kulagina 2 to 4 hours to rev up her supernormal powers. Her pulse races to 250.
So obviously this is still controversial and disputed by skeptics, but what new science isn't these days? But it is one of the most rigorously tested cases of parapsychology and telekinesis and being able to manipulate matter with our thoughts. There was also a case of Saint Joseph of Cupertino between 1603 and 1663, which is about levitation, and this is probably the strongest historical testament that we have. So someone named Franciscan Friar reported to levitate during prayer and ecstatic states. The Catholic Church's own canonization tribunal recorded around 70 separate levitation incidents under sworn testimony. Witnesses included cardinals, bishops, princes, doctors, and even Pope Urban V himself. But this is like an unusually strong documented evidence for levitation because it comes directly from the church. And there are people even today that are teaching telekinesis and being able to, move certain objects, even though they're light objects, being able to move them from place to place and use your consciousness to be able to influence like the outside world. So this is still like very much something that is still in the zeitgeist of our culture. It's just something that's very much like hidden below and not allowed to like fully express. But like imagine if this was allowed to fully express. Imagine if someone was born and they were like, you have a talent at telekinesis, and you were like put into a channel to be able to develop that work. And through belief or developing this junk DNA in our bodies, we were able to kind of develop that skill to be able to move something as heavy as a rock. Like it's actually not as far off as we think. And I honestly think probably one of our biggest downfalls in this civilization, as I said earlier, is our belief that this doesn't work, because belief is everything. It creates our reality. It is everything. It is the most powerful feeling that we have, and I think it is currently used against us to remember a lot of this stuff. But so obviously all of this is speculative, but come with me here, because if consciousness really was the tool and not ropes or ramps, what would this actually look like in practice? Like imagine being able to direct water with focused thought until it becomes precise enough, sharp enough to cut through stone like blade. I don't know exactly what that would feel like, and I don't know exactly how far this could go, but when you actually sit with these facts that these 3 esoteric traditions completely independently describe consciousness directing the matter, and what we're starting to be able to do today, it does make you wonder what else becomes possible when a civilization fully unlocks that capacity. Could you move an entire mountain? Could you build an entire city, not with cranes and cement, but by minds working together in resonance with each other and with the material itself? I don't have the answers to that right now, but I think it's definitely worth actually sitting with that question for a minute or hours instead of just rushing past it and poo-pooing it because it's not something that is currently proven. I think that we are in a prime position right now where things are going to start getting disproven over and over and over again. And there is going to be a new science and a new history that is probably going to emerge over the next few decades. And I mentioned Matthias de Stefano earlier, and I think this is where like a modern voice adds something really interesting to this. He has spoken extensively about what he describes as memories of being someone that lived in Atlantis, and makes a really great distinction, what I think is important. And he doesn't describe Atlantis as this advanced technological civilization the way that we usually would imagine it. It's like no phones, no machines, no metals and wires, but instead he's describing an advanced civilization of consciousness. That's their technology. And in his account was sound, music, words, and dreaming. And so communication happened through telepathy, through what he calls light language, and being able to connect across distance without any device at all. If that's true, even if it's just like partially true, then we haven't just lost a set of tools. We've lost an entire operating system, a way of being that didn't need machines because the mind itself was the machine. This just feels like such a better answer than even ETs coming down and building it for us. I believe that the technology has always been here. Yes, ETs may have dialed it up slightly and given us some direction, but our abilities as human is so much more deep than we think. There's an emerging hypothesis in plasma physics and UAP research that some of the craft people report seeing aren't solid metal vehicles at all, but they're more plasmoids, so self-organizing plasma formations, functioning almost like living thought forms rather than conventional spacecraft. Some researchers even describe plasma as a bridge between physical and non-physical reality, and a medium where consciousness and matter can actually interact with each other. So what if these ET beings were actually just curating these craft through their own mind? Maybe in the future, we don't have like artists that draw, we have artists that imagine and can create beautiful constructions and pyramids and craft and whatever we want just through our mind. And with the right technology, we can then drag that into the 3D reality that we see today. So what if the pyramids, Atlantis, and even some of these crafts we're calling UAPs all come from the exact same root capability? Not metal fabrication, not circuit boards, but consciousness directed with enough precision and coherence that it can shape plasma, shape stone, and shape matter itself. What if in a fully awakened civilization, you don't just have car builders and construction crews, you have consciousness builders, people whose entire role is to sit in a deep, coherent state and build cities, structures, even craft with focus, collective thought. That is a reality that I personally want to live in. So here's where I want to bring this back to something useful and real rather than just leaving you with interesting historical curiosity. Whether or not you believe these channel traditions are literal history, the pattern across all of them is really worth sitting with. Consciousness, not tools, is described as the actual mechanism. Directed thought, focused resonant, a coherent collective mind capable of shaping matter itself. And remember, right now, we're only using a small fraction of what our body and mind are actually capable of. If Cayce, Thoth, Ra, and even modern voices like Matthias de Stefano all independently point to consciousness as a literal functional technology, then the real question isn't how did they do it thousands of years ago? It's what happened to that capacity within us. Is it actually gone, or is it just dormant, waiting for the right state, the right coherence to access it again? That lost technology might not be something we need to rediscover in a tomb. It might be something that we can rediscover in ourselves. And that is what feels personally very true to me. If this fascinated you as much as it fascinates me, please make sure that you subscribe to this channel, because I want to go even deeper into these traditions and these esoteric concepts and explore the planes of consciousness and what is possible to us when we truly allow ourselves to go there. And if you want to start building the capacity to access these expanded states for yourself, that's exactly what I help people to do inside of the In-Awe membership, which is a breathwork and subconscious reprogramming program that is designed to help you connect with the version of your consciousness that's always been capable of even more than you realize. All of the information is below in the description. Please make sure that you give this a thumbs up, comment what your biggest takeaway was, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye guys.